Welcome back, everybody. This is week 8 of Liberation Music Therapy, the 11-week workshop teach-in, and this is presentation 8 on caste and class. As usual, we've been going through the praxis wheel, which is an 8-spoke framework to basically step into activist work and engage in real time in a directional process that can continuously move forward. We've been going through all the different spokes, and it's led us to the 6th spoke, which is educational practices and transformational practices. Because this is such a big topic, I split it into 3 sections, 3 separate sessions entirely. The first being high control dynamics and fascism, this week, which is caste and class, and the next week, which is pedagogy of the oppressed. So for today, it is on caste and class, and it's split into 2 parts, caste and class, and part 2, which is the imperial boomerang. So, part 1, class and caste. So first we're going to look at class and caste. Class is a system of economic position within a society, which is shaped by our relationship to labor, our relationship to work, income, and resources. So we might think of it as labor, income, and capital. And the way we might measure social class is based on income or occupation or labor role or somebody's education level or access to capital and resources. It can conceptually shift across time, but power does concentrate structurally. It really does not shift much, especially in the way that wealth inequality has set our society up. Actual realistic ability to experience class mobility going upward. And the real way to think about it is that class is defined by one's relationship to the means of production. So if you think of it this way, a working class person is connected to their means of production in that they don't own what they work for. They're hired to work somewhere. They either sell their labor or they sell pieces of their intellectual property. But the point is that working class, you are selling something of yourself to a capitalist. And this can help us understand how somebody who is a professional sports athlete who makes millions of dollars, but they don't own anything. This is representative of how a person can be in that sort of economic financial situation and still be considered working class. If you'll notice, a large majority of professional athletes, when they go through the programs, they will make a lot of money, but then they will not be able to keep that money. And that is a class issue. There's a couple of different ways to think about class. The most kind of hierarchical structure that we think of is working class, middle class, upper class, lower class. But we're going to get into much more of that later as we talk through this session. The second group is caste. And so caste is a fixed or an essentialist social group in which an individual is born within a particular system of social stratification. So within such a system, individuals are expected to marry exclusively within that caste or follow lifestyles that are linked to the particular occupation associated with the caste, or hold a ritual status observed within a hierarchy, and interact with others based on cultural notions of exclusion or inclusion, with certain castes considered as either pure or more polluted than the others. Caste is something that's assigned at birth. It determines the human social value, meaning that it is how you occupy a space and how you are perceived. And it's enforced through things like law, culture, tradition, violence, and social exclusion. Just prime examples here in the United States, but Jim Crow laws and one drop laws were two very serious ways in which the racialized caste system was established here in the United States. And so these are not inherent in regards to they are real. They are inherent in that these are circumstances in which you're born the way you are born, and you're then funneled into a rigid structure. So that's the difference between class and caste. So we're going to get into how these things are actually created, how they came about. And I want to keep in mind that, first and foremost, I am a music therapist, a composer, and an activist. I am not a historian, a political scientist, or anything in regards to that realm of things. This is, again, just for context of the praxis wheel, this is a very simplified framework to just help understand the situations that are happening in real time right in front of us when we are in the role of being a facilitator. So the first thing we're going to speak about is capitalism. So capitalism has gone through a couple of various stages: merchant capitalism, industrial capitalism, monopoly capitalism, imperialist capitalism, neoliberal capitalism, and late capitalism, which I did not include, just out of user error. Capitalism is an economic system based on private ownership of the means of production and their use for profit. It is characterized by private property, capital accumulation, competitive markets, wage, labor, commodification, and a growth imperative. This is key for our purposes today. While capitalism has driven technological innovation and global trade, it is also characterized by cyclical instability, marked by periods of growth, followed by recessions, and persistent inequality rooted in who controls the productive assets. So if we look through the structure, merchant, industrial, monopoly, and imperialist, we would say that imperialism represents the highest stage of capitalism, in which monopoly finance capital from industrialized powers, historically Western Europe, United States, and Japan, dominates less developed regions through political, economic, military, and cultural control. So imperialism relies on the export of capital rather than just goods, using global monopolies, financial oligarchies, and coercive state power to secure resources, labor, and markets. This creates a world divided into exploiters and exploited, decision makers and the dependent, with super profits from abroad helping stabilize elites at home. So again, capitalism has historically unfolded through 5 overlapping stages. And neoliberal is a little confusing to get into because some call what we're in right now neoliberal, some call what we're in right now late stage capitalism. But it's historically unfolded through 5 overlapping stages: merchant, industrial, monopoly, imperialist, and neoliberal, each grounded in conquest and extraction. So racial capitalism shows how these processes have always been organized along lines of racial hierarchy, from slavery and colonial dispossession to modern systems of labor exploitation and environmental sacrifice zones. Fascism emerges when the external violence of empire is redirected inward, employing authoritarianism and political repression to suppress dissent, protect the ruling classes, and preserve the system during crisis. It's a little more complicated, as we spoke about last week, but that really ends up being the end goal here. When capitalism is in whack, the elite class will take reactionary chauvinist politics developing amongst the petit bourgeois and will exploit that and use it for their own gains. So this structure is evident in contemporary figures such as Donald Trump, Elon Musk, Peter Thiel. They're white, heteronormative male elites born into extreme privilege, whose fortunes and influences are rooted in histories of colonial wealth, corporate power, and patriarchal social order. So their prominence is the product of systemic patterns: nepotism, concentration of ownership, hoarding, and political capture. And that reproduces capitalism's entrenched inequality. Capitalism, just to help us understanding, is what created what we would call social class, and specifically this type of social class that I'm about to describe. And the traditional terms that we might use are bourgeois, petit bourgeois, proletariat, lumpenproletariat, and the subaltern. But bourgeois, this is the capitalist ruling class that owns the means of production and accumulates wealth by extracting surplus value from labor while shaping law, shaping culture, and shaping ideology to protect property and profit. The petit bourgeois, this is where we have the small business owners, the professionals or managerial class. They own limited capital, they exercise delegated authority, they are positioned precariously between labor and capital, and they're often pulled ideologically towards stability and respectability regarding the elite, as opposed to solidarity with the proletariat. You can see, just in this current era, again, I'm only using it because we're witnessing it in real time, but the Trump era, consider the amount of folks from the January 6th insurrection who were small business owners or people who had small amounts of wealth in local spaces. One just piece of evidence of that is, who has the money to buy all those flags and all those decorations that they put up everywhere? It's like not working class people. So it really does follow a behavior pattern where we look at the petit bourgeois, and that's often where fascism will fester in really the ideological space, and then will be brought into the elite eventually when they need it. But it really festers and develops amongst the petit bourgeois. Then there's the proletariat, and this is our social class. This is us. If you're watching this, most likely you are from this class. But the proletariat, that's the working class, and that does not own the means of production and must sell labor power to survive, producing value collectively while remaining structurally dispossessed of control over its product. So we don't own anything. The proletariat does not own property. We can own things, but we do not own land. We are not land owners. We are not business owners. Yeah, does not mean it can get much more complicated. There are many proletariat who do operate businesses. It's a little more nuanced than simply just economic stability and access to money. It also has to do with power and positionality, which is really what the next slide is going to be all about. Then there's the lumpenproletariat, and this is really the group that I probably work the most with in the carceral setting or anywhere in what you might consider the hood, or just any place that there is poverty-stricken areas within a capitalist system. And that term that we use is called lumpenproletariat, and those excluded from stable wage labor under capitalism. They're often criminalized. They're informal and surplus populations. They're often stigmatized, they're often exploited, yet shaped by the material abandonment rather than moral failure. And so this is really any person who may be doing illicit sex work or illicit drug trade, anybody in that sort of social space where you are not connected to capital, but you are still impacted by the material abandonment. That's what we would call the lumpen proletariat. And then there's the subaltern, which is peoples and groups systematically denied political voice, cultural recognition, and institutional power under capitalist and colonial hierarchies, whose labor, land, and knowledge are extracted without representation. So if we want to think about it in an American context, somebody who might be living within the lumpen proletariat worldview or way of navigating the world may be somebody from the African American diaspora and ancestors of kidnapped, enslaved Africans. Whereas in the same context, a subaltern might be related to an indigenous person living on a reservation that is also poverty-stricken. It is just the structure on how the poverty was created is slightly different. Now, that being said, we're talking about real human beings. These are not strict, rigid lines. These are, like everything else, frameworks to just start to give us an idea on how to categorize things or think about things. Like, when I work in the prison, I will tell you that when I learned about the concept of lumpen proletariat, that helped me tremendously, because I realized that solutions that I was putting forward to a lot of the folks were proletariat-oriented solutions as opposed to lumpen proletariat solutions. And I'll put that in a very contextual way, but the use of violence is very different when you move from one social class to another. So the lumpen proletariat, that is a community who has very limited access to the legal structures or limited access to just even ways on holding people accountable. So violence will be used as a way to communicate, hand-to-hand physical confrontation. That happens also in the proletariat, but it is different because you can call the police if you are a member of the proletariat. It can be a little more complicated depending on where your caste location is. But this is just to kind of give an idea on understanding people from different social classes communicate differently. People in the bourgeois, they use violence, I would actually say, more heinously than many who use violence in the lumpen proletariat. Elon Musk, the example I always use for people, a guy I work with in prison is going to swing at me if I say something that rubs him the wrong way. Elon Musk might sue me out of existence, and it's the same amount of violence regarding the impulse, but the power dynamic is completely different. So I want to add a little bit more nuance and contemporizing of these terms, because these are the sort of classic Marxist terms. And this does get a little bit more overlap, but this is a framework that I learned about a few years ago that I like just for kind of understanding how to navigate through various social classes. So not only does social class have to do with wealth and income, but there are actually micro classes or ladders, steps of a ladder, that this model puts forward that is really helpful. So this is called the 3-class ladder analysis. And so there are 3 class ladders: the elite ladder, the gentry ladder, the labor ladder, and then the underclass, which is a ladderless class. So we'll start with the elite ladder. So the elite class owns the majority of private property and values establishment control. To maintain dominance, they often exploit the labor and gentry and underclasses. So you have at the bottom the strivers, and above that is the elite servants. Above that is the national elite. And then finally, you have the global elite, which is the smallest percentage of all of these groups. So the elite ladder, this really consists of about 1% or 1.5% of the population. A way to think about it is the striver is somebody who is maybe not completely connected in elite circles, but they are definitely right on the outskirts. This is the rank and file if we think about the gang structure, the cultic structure from last week. But these are often, I would say Charlie Kirk was a striver when he first came onto the scene, when he was about 18 or 19 years old, to give a real life example of somebody who might represent that. He grew into an elite servant, if we're using this framework. But he started off as a striver. He was a rich kid from a rich family who was able to utilize that to make connections and build a career that elevated him to the elite level. Then there's the elite servants. These are, I would say, think of Alan Dershowitz or any kind of very wealthy person who provides services to the elite class. So this can be lawyers, this can be public figures or pundits. That's why I use Charlie Kirk as an example, because I would say he was at an elite servant level. He was the head of an organization, Turning Point USA. So an elite servant. The national elite, this is the folks who are connected. Either they have large local power, or they have large connection nationally or across the way. So we might not necessarily know national elite names the way that we will know a lot of the global elite names. But national elite would be people like Congress members or movie stars may fit into this in some categories, though they're probably more cultural influencers in the gentry ladder. But this is just to give an idea on what national elite means. But this is people who have a lot of power, but within their sphere, whether it be the local infrastructure, like a powerful lawyer family in a small county, or connection across the legal system. So that would be the national elite. And then the global elite, these are the families and people of which we can name. Peter Thiel, Elon Musk, Larry Ellison, Donald Trump, Bill Gates. These are the people that are easily nameable. They are the top 0.1%. So that's the elite ladder. The gentry ladder, that's the ladder that prioritizes access to reputable institutions and cultural movements, values education, values cultural influence over income. If we think of the transitional gentry, that might be early career artist or a college student, intern, somebody who is getting into some kind of either creative work or intelligentsia, or some kind of institutional piece. So clergy may fit into this realm. Then there's the primary gentry. This would be what I call the working class gentry. This is your adjunct professors. This is your non-tenure professor. This is your doctor who doesn't have a full job. They work part-time at 3 different places, or they have a steady job at one place. This would be primary gentry, as what I would refer to as the working class within the gentry framework. Then there's high gentry, and these are the people who are at the top of institutions. I would say maybe the president of a hospital or a really well-respected local writer, things like this. And then there's the cultural influencers, and these are folks like the scientists that, like Albert Einstein, or the movie stars that we were just speaking about, musicians, artists, any person in kind of the intelligentsia or the creatives who was at that level of attention or information or institutional knowledge oriented labor, or that's how they make their money. So then we get to the labor class. This is the majority of people. This is about 65% of the population. Oh, and sorry, I didn't explain. The elite ladder is about 1.5%. The gentry ladder is about 23.5%. And the labor ladder is about 65%. The labor ladder prioritizes work where status is based on income and effort. So there's secondary labor. This I would call part-time workers, people getting into a trade, people working at McDonald's for a first job, that sort of sphere. Gig workers who are not steady in their income, but that's secondary labor. Primary labor, this is your average rank and file working class person. Then you have high skill labor. This is the laborers who have to have more training or more education to maybe earn more income or have a higher position in some sort of space in which they are utilizing their labor. And then finally, there's labor leadership. And this is where we might have the union leaders or maybe a petite bourgeois person who owns a local construction company or a local gravel company, but they still do the work. They still are making their money off of the labor itself as opposed to capital and growth from that. So those are the three main ladders. And then there's the underclass, and I'm not going to explain all of them, but this is legal system involved. Involves houselessness or people who are transient, underground sex work, undocumented living situations, informal vending, any other marginalized or excluded group would be in the underclass. But I actually like this way to explain class a little better because then bourgeois, petit bourgeois, proletariat, and lumpen proletariat. Not that those classic terms are not worthwhile, but I feel like this gives a little bit more insight into how class is actually structured. So, for instance, somebody like Donald Trump, who is probably from the striver and or elite servant class in regards to his income, has become global elite due to his political power. And one of the pieces is that he actually was able to speak as if he was in the labor class. He was not. That is what right-wing populism is they are fake populists. They are elite interests while using language directed towards the labor ladder, but really in service of the elite ladder. At least that's how I think about it. White supremacy and patriarchy. So let's really consider what this means. White supremacy is a political, economic, and cultural system that normalizes white dominance by structuring institutions, laws, and narratives to privilege whiteness while devaluing and dispossessing non-white peoples. And patriarchy is a social system that centers male authority and control, organizing power around masculinity while subordinating women and gender diverse people through norms, violence, and economic dependence. So, in the United States, under the capitalist system, the racial caste system and the gender caste system we live under is white supremacy and patriarchy. A term that I do like to introduce here is called curiarchy. And this is really how every individual person's experience is an interlocking system of domination where race, gender, class, sexuality, ability, nationality, religion reinforce one another, producing layered forms of oppression rather than a single hierarchy. So this is just, I like to introduce this term here just because it helps understand that you can experience multiple types of experiences at the same time. But for our purposes, the two largest caste systems that we want to be aware of are the racial caste system of white supremacy and the gender caste system of patriarchy. If we think of it like this, white supremacy is the belief and structural arrangement that people of European, especially Christian European descent, are inherently superior to others. It prioritizes bloodline over wealth or social status. The incoherent and self-serving belief that light-skinned or white people are superior to those with darker skin. This logic of supremacy through imperial Christianity, where Christianity became synonymous with whiteness, civilization, divine right to rule, and clean blood. These ideas were strategically constructed to justify colonialism, genocide, and slavery. The Crusades from the 11th to 13th centuries marked an early stage in this development when Christian Europe launched brutal campaigns to seize Muslim-controlled trade routes and establish economic and military supremacy. During the Spanish Inquisition, which began in 1478, the Catholic Church institutionalized the concept of limpieza de sangre, cleanliness of blood. It's a racialized theology that labeled Jews and Muslims of Moorish descent, even converts, as permanently impure or possessing unclean blood. So, white supremacy builds a racial caste system around that. The reason I use the example of the Spanish Inquisition, that was the first time that a legal structure was put forward in which a biological and or lineage-oriented legal status was implemented. There had been other oppressive forms of implemented legal structures. There had been legal structures against Jewish people, legal structures against Muslims, but it was during the Inquisition that a racialized law was put forward, putting an inherent quality to white Christian Europeans. White supremacy builds a racial caste system, and patriarchy enforces a gendered hierarchy that privileges cisgender men, especially those aligned with whiteness, with wealth, and with heteronormativity. So these are not single-axis prejudices, but a complex, self-extending system of domination which people can be oppressed in some relations and privileges in others. So this logic has structured regimes and policies from colonial dispossession, slavery, Jim Crow, and redlining to apartheid and other nationalist citizenship orders. So its goal is the steady discipline of bodies, the steady discipline of reproduction, of labor, land, lineage, knowledge, and resources in service of a racialized, gendered capitalism. So violence against women is a core mechanism of patriarchal control. At least 1 in 3 women worldwide has been beaten, coerced into sex, or otherwise abused, usually by someone that she knows. Forms range from domestic abuse to marital rape, sexual harassment, sexual assault, and forced marriage. Armed groups have quite literally used wartime and genocidal rape, sexual slavery, forced sterilization, and reproductive control to enforce political dominance, ethnic cleansing, and social subjugation and subordination. Intimate partner homicides accounts for nearly 40% of female homicides globally, often tied to coercive control, weapons, and prior threats. The LGBTQ plus community, they face targeting through criminalization, through vigilante attacks, and through corrective violence, which is a form of violence that is done to quote-unquote help an LGBTQ person not be LGBTQ anymore. It does not work. These patterns are part of a continuum of gendered, racialized terror that preserve elite control. So lasting change requires dismantling the order itself, which is a very, very complex process. But it's about looking at the centuries-old fusion of white supremacy and patriarchy as an engine of systemic violence for capitalism. It's really important that we consider rainbow coalition, and I think of it as three pieces, meaning that we can look at things through a worker solidarity lens, but we also have to include an anti-racism lens, as well as a gender abolitionist lens. And these are all three different things. So somebody whom you can feel relationship with, solidarity with, in a worker solidarity experience, you may not have the same kinds of feelings when it comes to gender abolition or anti-racism. We'll explain what all of this means, but the real point of putting this out is that Rainbow Coalition just simply means reaching across diverse movements and diverse communities, that the only way to defeat fascism is grounded in the belief that solidarity across differences is necessary to challenge those entrenched systems of power. It comes from specific socialist political organizing that came out of groups in Chicago. It was started by the Black Panther Party, but they grew really by developing relationships with the Young Patriots organization and the Young Lords organization. Young Lords being a radical Puerto Rican group, and the Young Patriots being a young radical white Southern organization, all rural white folks who had left Appalachia and lived in Chicago now. But the point is that many, many colors and many, many spectrums should be involved in our organizing. Cool. Now we're going to get into part 2, which is the actual imperial boomerang. You'll notice that the imperial boomerang, it starts from capitalism and it goes to fascism. We already covered capitalism and white supremacy in regards to this, so we're not going to cover those two pieces the rest of the slides. We're just going to be looking at colonialism, genocide, and slavery, and then a slight discussion on fascism. So from Namibia, Southern Africa, to Belarus, Eastern Europe, a single logic of annihilation was used to crush resistance by erasing entire communities of human beings. In 1893, German Schutztruppe and Allied Bastard fighters attacked the Hornkrat settlement in German Southwest Africa, killing 80 civilians and kidnapping 40 women and children. An early act that eventually culminated in the 1904 to 1908 Herero and Nama genocide, with extermination orders, death marches, and death camps like Shark Island. Half a century later, the same German army forces, though under the name Nazi Germany, sought to depopulate and decolonize Eastern Europe, killing millions, destroying over 92,000 villages, and enslaving survivors. The 1943 Katyn massacre, 149 civilians, including 70 to 75 children, were burned alive and shot. It's one of countless reprisal killings meant to terrorize occupied Belarus into submission. So these are not isolated atrocities, but nodes in the same project. Invasion, racialized conquest, and the belief that entire peoples can be erased to secure control. So, fascism arises when capitalism is in crisis is a partially accurate statement, but it reduces a deeply complex phenomenon to a single cause. So economic instability may create fertile ground for fascism, but its roots often run through the histories of empire and colonization. So one framework that adds necessarily depth is the imperial boomerang theory, the theory that the violence used to dominate colonized peoples abroad inevitably returns to shape domestic institutions and internal repression. So, as Amy Cesar argues in his book, Discourse on Colonialism, the fascist violence that erupted in Europe was not a historical anomaly, but the logical extension of brutal colonial practices turned inward on the colonizers' own populations. Hannah Arendt echoed Cesar's insights in her book, The Origin of Totalitarianism, and as well as Michael Foucault, who further outlined how colonial surveillance, and repression shape domestic institutions. We can see this right now. The behavior that was done to Iraqis in the Iraq War is being used right now on the Latin community. Everything that was created during the Iraq War, ICE, Homeland Security, is now being turned inward on our Latin brothers and sisters and siblings. So the theory links imperial practices with domestic repression. Tactics like militarized policing and surveillance developed abroad are reused at home to suppress dissent and enforce control. So Vietnam War strategies, for instance, were used to target the Black liberation, the civil rights, and the anti-war movements of the same era. So U.S. policing, shaped by racial and imperial violence before its global empire, uses professionalized police to control, mainly by incarcerating Black, brown, marginalized, and poor communities. This domestic system mirrors and is reinforced by U.S. military behavior abroad, where tactics of occupation, surveillance, counterinsurgency are exported, refined, and then imported back home to suppress dissent, contain marginalized populations, and protect the interest of capital and private property. One last comment. This framework builds on Raoul Peck's Exterminate All the Brutes study guide, which is a really good documentary as well. And it integrates, I've integrated some feminist and abolitionist thought into it that was not in his version. But it's to help provide a lens to examine the intersections of capitalism and fascism within the broader colonial system. So the point is that this foundation examines the evolution of capitalism as a central element of imperialist logic, recognizing that these patterns show that imperial and domestic violence quite literally reinforce each other. So we're going to get into colonialism. Colonialism is the imposition of political, economic, and cultural control over a region and its people by an external power. It can take several interconnected forms. So settler colonialism, extractive colonialism, surrogate colonialism, and internal colonialism. So let me explain. Settler colonialism involves the displacement and replacement of indigenous populations with settler societies for permanent occupation and control. This ongoing system operates through legal, cultural, and military means, self-justified by belief systems like the doctrine of discovery, manifest destiny, Zionism, terrace nullius, Calvinist dominionism, and Lebensraum. Some examples are the United States, Canada, Australia, and Israel. Extractive colonialism focuses on exploiting land, labor, and resources while keeping the indigenous populations in place as a subjugated labor force. So examples like this include British Israel, the Dutch East Indies, and the Congo Free State. Surrogate colonialism. This occurs when an imperial power supports a distinct settler group to occupy and control a region on its behalf. So examples include the Zionist settlers in British Mandate Palestine, Afrikaners in South Africa, and the Ulster Scots in Northern Ireland. And then internal colonialism. And this refers to the systemic domination of marginalized groups within a nation's own borders. So this can include the oppression of Native and Black Americans here in the United States, the way that the Tibetans and the Uyghurs are treated in China, and the way that indigenous Siberians are treated in Russia. So the most prominent of these for our purposes is settler colonialism. And settler colonial ideology shaped global violence. So Hitler, for instance, cited U.S. westward expansion of manifest destiny, and the treatment of Native Americans as a model for German conquest in Eastern Europe. In Mein Kampf, he quite literally praised Manifest Destiny as a model for Lebensraum, which is living space, a policy of conquest, racial purification, and resettlement. This fueled the Nazis' regime's genocide, ethnic cleansing, apartheid policies, and extermination of Jewish people, Roma people, and Slavic people in camps like Auschwitz. Settler colonialism is a system of racialized supremacy, indigenous elimination, ethno-nationalism, and territorial domination. So after the first two world wars, formal empires faded, but colonial domination continued through economic dependency, military presence, and political influence. This includes exploitative debts, foreign military bases, trade imbalances, and actions by multinational corporations. Two more terms that can help us understand colonialism is the global north and the global south. You may have heard terms like first world, second world, third world. We don't really use those terms anymore. The terms that we use contemporarily is global north and global south. What this is referring to is the global north is wealthy, industrialized nations, and this includes US, Canada, Western Europe, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. Whereas the global south is formerly colonized regions in places such as Africa, Latin America, the Caribbean, and much of Asia, which remains structurally disadvantaged due to historical exploitation as well as ongoing neoliberal policies. So north and south, it's not about literal directions, it's just about top and bottom. That's the way I think about it. Now, we're getting into, this is the most triggering section of the whole presentation. So I'm just giving you guys a heads up that you can always step away if need be. But we're going to be talking about atrocity crimes. So the four major atrocity crimes that we're speaking about are genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and ethnic cleansing. So genocide are acts committed with the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group, including killing, causing serious harm, or deliberately creating conditions meant to eliminate the group. The reason if you're watching this and you saw me slightly roll my eyes when I read the word intent, that word was put forward during the Geneva Convention by three world powers that were very likely going to be considered committers of genocide, and that was the USA, the USSR, and I believe the UK. So they put the word intent in there through the negotiations, and that word has made it so hard to try some of the genocides that have taken place. It's very ridiculous, but it is the truth of it. War crimes. These are serious violations of the law of war during armed conflicts, such as targeting civilians, torturing prisoners, using prohibited weapons, or destroying civilian infrastructure without military necessity. Crimes against humanity. This is slightly different than war crimes. War crimes are during an act of war, so there are laws of war that are put forward. But crimes against humanity, this is widespread or systematic acts such as murder, enslavement, deportation, apartheid, torture, rape, or persecution committed against civilian populations, whether during war or peacetime. And many scholars agree that there is a fourth atrocity crime, which is ethnic cleansing, and that's the forced removal of a population from a territory through violence and intimidation or coercion in order to make an area ethnically homogeneous, often involving crimes against humanity and sometimes genocide. I didn't put the term in on this slide, but I'm realizing, but there's also a term called genocidal rape, which is the use of rape to commit genocide. And it's a fifth category that is being considered a separate atrocity crime. So we're going to talk about specifically genocide because that is the one that connects to the imperial boomerang. So there are 5 pieces that are considered to be engaged when genocide is taking place. That is, killing members of a group, causing serious bodily and mental harm to this group, inflicting conditions to bring about the physical destruction of a group, preventing births from happening within a group, or forcibly transferring children from a group. There's another term that is not connected to genocide scholarship, but I find important just to understand in this concept. But this is also social murder, which is a concept used to describe an unnatural death that is believed to occur due to social, political, or economic oppression instead of direct violence. So this is not necessarily the same kind of murder that Israel is doing right now with using food as a weapon for the people in Gaza, but it would be a term that we might use for the Trump administration taking SNAP benefits away, using food as a weapon in that way. So that's I just think it's an important term to understand for this slide as well. The strict legal threshold, particularly the requirement to prove intent, has historically hindered prosecutions and excluded many forms of systemic violence from recognition. Genocide is not limited to mass killings. It also includes slower structural forms of destruction. These can involve forced displacement to inhospitable lands, suppression of language, religion, and traditions, targeting sacred sites, and reproductive control through sexual violence, sterilization, and restrictive natalist policies. Eugenics, once embraced by governments across Europe, North America, and beyond, justified such measurements under the guise of improving the population, often targeting disabled people and racial and ethnic minorities, the LGBTQ communities, and any other group deemed unfit. So while discredited, its logic persists in policies that deny reproductive rights, impose sterilization requirements, or limit healthcare to reduce certain populations. Modern far-right pronatalism promotes these ideas by promoting high birth rates amongst some groups while restricting others. Indigenous, Black, feminist, trans, and decolonial scholars call for expanding the legal definition of genocide to include these slow, systemic forms of violence that erode communities over time. Something that was put forward by legal scholar Gregory Stanton. This is the 10 stages of genocide, and this has really helped me understand a lot of many of the situations going on in the world right now, unfortunately, including Darfur, including the Uyghurs, and including Gaza. So genocide is not a single act, but a process. It unfolds in stages that may occur simultaneously, recur over time, or escalate out of sequence. So recognizing these stages early is essential. Failure to name genocide while it is happening delays action until mass atrocities are already underway. So again, these things do not happen in a specific order. These things can happen simultaneously, but I'm going to just give a little definition and example of each one. Classification. Society is divided into us versus them amongst ethnic, racial, religious, political, gendered, or any other social lines. Examples would be Jews versus Aryans in Nazi Germany, Tutsis versus Hutus in Rwanda, illegal immigrant versus citizen in the United States, Muslim versus Hindu in India, the Rohingya and the Bamar in Myanmar, the Armenians versus the Young Turks in the Ottoman Empire, the Circassians versus the Russian Empire, settler versus Indian in North America. Symbolization, number 2. Visual, linguistic, and bureaucratic markers that enforce group differences. So you might see the yellow stars for Jews in Nazi Germany, or the red ID cards for the Tutsis in Rwanda. There were apartheid passbooks in South Africa, badges for Romani people under Nazi rule, numbered tags for Cambodian prisoners in Khmer Rouge, color-coded ID cards for Palestinians under Israeli occupation, haircutting and forced European dress for native children in the United States and Canadian boarding schools. Discrimination, number 3. These are laws and institutions that strip targeted groups of rights and resources. So consider the Nuremberg laws, Jim Crow laws, anti-Rohingya citizenship laws, Israeli nation-state laws, Soviet deportation of Crimean Tatars, the denial of land rights to Aboriginal Australians, the U.S. Indian Removal Act and reservation system, Republican bans on gender-affirming healthcare. Dehumanization, number 4. The targeted group is compared to vermin, disease, or evil. So you can consider how the Jews were considered rats, Tutsis considered cockroaches, migrants considered animals here in the United States and in Europe, indigenous people labeled savages by settlers, Armenians referred to as cancer, Palestinians referred to as human animals, trans women referred to as predators. Number 5, organization. Genocide is always planned, whether by states, militias, corporations, or ideological networks. They are always planned. There has not been a single genocide that was not planned. Keep that in mind with every genocide you learn about. Examples: the Nazi SS death squads, the Interhamraoui militias in Rwanda, the slave patrols here in the United States, the Janjaweed militias in Darfur, the Myanmar military campaigns going on right now, the Ustasi extermination camps in Croatia, U.S. military and militia coordination in the Sand Creek massacre, and then, of course, ICE and CBT mass detention programs right now. Polarization. This is very important. Number 6. Moderates are silenced or eliminated, and propaganda deepens division. This was the bans on Jewish-Gentile relationships, or the assassination of moderate Hutus in Rwanda, silencing Palestinian peace activists. For instance, not letting a Palestinian speak at the DNC. Murder of indigenous leaders who were resisting the U.S. westward expansion, targeting Maya elders in Guatemala. Number 7, preparation. Plans are formalized. This is where lists are made, camps are built, euphemisms are put out like final solution or ethnic cleansing. I said final solution like the Nazis. Ethnic cleansing was done by the Serbians. Israeli siege infrastructure in Gaza, the Rohingya containment zone, the Ottoman deportation orders, the Spanish forced labor quotas for Taino people in Hispaniola, the U.S. Doles Act, land allotments preceding mass dispossession. Number 8, persecution. Victims are identified, isolated, and deprived of resources. Jewish ghettos, the Trail of Tears, the Gaza blockade, the Ugar re-education camps, the Darfuri village burnings, the internment of Japanese Americans. Number 9, extermination. This is mass killings. Mass killing begins framed as a cleansing of society. You can consider the Auschwitz gas chambers, the Armenian death marches, the machete massacres, the massacre of 1937, Wounded Knee massacre in 1890, the Khmer Rouge executions, the Nama machine gun massacres, German Southwest Africa. And then finally, the 10 stages of genocide is number 10, denial. Perpetrators destroy evidence, blame victims, and rewrite history. You can see this in Holocaust denial, Turkish denial of Armenian genocide, U.S. denial of indigenous genocide, or the U.S. denial of slavery as genocide. Israel and Western culture in general's denial of the Palestinian genocide. Chinese denial of the sterilizations going on right now. Guatemalan denial of the Mayan genocide. So we move to the next piece of the imperial boomerang. If we think of white supremacy or patriarchy as the structure in which to exploit, to create polarization for capital, and we consider colonization the need for expansive growth, the need for more resources, because capitalism relies on growth. That's the entire point of it. So that's where colonialism is about the land expansion, resource expansion. Genocide is about the removal of human beings that already exist amongst that land and resources. And so the next step in the imperial boomerang is slavery. And this is broken down into a couple of different categories. But there's chattel slavery, which is the most impactful for our purposes. But they're all impactful for everything that we do in this work. But chattel slavery, a system in which people are treated as legally owned property, bought and sold, stripped of rights, and exploited for labor or reproduction. And then there's bonded labor. This is a form of coercion where individuals are forced to work to repay a debt that is often manipulated to be unpayable, and it traps them into indefinite servitude. There is dependence. These are peoples whose survival is controlled by others through economic, legal, or social dependency, limiting autonomy and reinforcing hierarchical power relations. This does not necessarily have to be fully exploitation. For some of these pieces in here, consider children or consider the elderly if you are now taking a person's finances over. But the point that we're speaking about is this is when there is that exploitation going on, and slavery being the most extreme of that exploitation. Forced labor, this is work extracted under threat, violence, or coercion, where individuals cannot freely leave and are denied meaningful consent. And I put just as a subgroup, but child soldiers and child labor. This is the exploitation of children for military service or economic production. You're violating not only human rights, but child rights. Because you're also impacting their development and their body autonomy when they really need to be free and growing. I will tell you all that when I started looking at the world through this model, the child soldier phenomenon did not seem so foreign once I realized that it is quite literally how gangs operate here in this very country. This is a structural issue. Forced marriage, a practice in which one or more parties are compelled to marry without free or informed consent, often involving control over sexuality, labor, and reproduction. And there are other uses that just explain it for any other kind of practice of exploitation or domination that would meet the criteria of enslavement, even if it doesn't fall into these sort of formalized or traditional definitions. Many scholars and abolitionists prefer the word enslaved person to emphasize humanity and imposed bondage, while others use the word slave to stress the system's violence. Both are valid. I try to use enslaved person. Part of it is just where my positioning is. Part of it is just based on personal conversations with people I really respect their opinions of and perspectives on. But it's just something to really take into consideration when we're being mindful with how we speak about these things. But let's break down what slavery actually is. Slavery is the ownership and control of people as property enforced through violence, coercion, systematic dehumanization. It has taken many forms, as we spoke: chattel slavery, bonded labor, forced labor, wage slavery, and it's shaped global capitalism and modern racial hierarchies. So there's a Swahili term, maafa, which I did not put in the slide, M-A-A-F-A. But the Swahili term maafa means great disaster, and it names the centuries-long genocide of African people through enslavement, colonization, and racial violence, claiming up to 200 million lives. There's another term, which is the maangamizi, which is another Swahili term for intentional destruction. And this refers to systems of oppression, economic, political, and cultural that persist in long after the legal abolition, continuing the logic of slavery through things like incarceration, forced labor, displacement, and economic subjugation. The transatlantic slave trade trafficked over 12 million Africans to the Americas between the 15th and 19th century, with millions more dying during raids, marches, and the Middle Passage. European empires and the United States amassed immense wealth from this atrocity, with modern institutions from J.P. Morgan Chase to Harvard directly tied to its profits. Other systems, including the Trans-Saharan slave trade, the Red Sea slave trade, and the Indian Ocean slave trade, trafficked millions to North Africa, the Middle East, and South Asia. Sexual violence was systemic, and medical experimentation was conducted on enslaved people. One of the most horrific examples is the case of Narca Westcott, Lucy Zimmerman, and Betsy Harris, 3 enslaved black women now remembered as the mothers of gynecology. In the 1840s, in a slave infirmary in Montgomery, Alabama, J. Marion Sims performed dozens of genital surgeries on them, often forcing other enslaved women to hold them down under threat of violence. Many slave hospitals operated as hospitals for experimentation, where white physicians used enslaved women, enslaved men, and enslaved children for non-consensual surgeries, medical trials, and surgical training. The suffering endured by Anarcha, Lucy, and Betsy became the foundations for the techniques still used in modern gynecology. So in the United States, the policing system is another one that evolved directly from slave patrols designed to capture, punish, and control enslaved Africans. After emancipation, these forces enforced black codes, vagrancy laws, and convict leasing, which was re-enslaving newly freed black people through prison labor. Northern police departments suppressed labor uprisings and immigrant protests, serving to protect property and the capitalist order. And this expanded into national and covert agencies like the FBI's COINTELPRO, targeting civil rights and liberation movements, while ICE functions today as a transnational police force to detain, deport, and disappear migrants, especially brown, Muslim, black, and indigenous people, without any due process. Outside the African diaspora, other communities endured systems of enslavement. Chinese and Indian coolies, as they were known, were shipped under deceptive contracts after abolition. Bonded laborers in South Asia and Brazil, child soldiers in Central Africa and the Middle East, migrant workers trapped under Gulf states' kafala systems in Europe, coerced wartime labor under Nazi and imperial Japanese and fascist Italy regimes, and mass incarceration in the United States under the 13th Amendment's labor loophole. In every case, the underlying logic is the same: forced confinement, coerced labor, and racialized or class-based control. Modern containment systems include immigration detention centers, psychiatric institutions, concentration camps, jails, juvenile facilities, house arrest, parole, probation, e-carceration, which is a whole new thing of electronic surveillance. It's cheaper. So get ready for that one, y'all. And the troubled teen industry. While revolutions and abolition acts ended chattel slavery and law, these systems simply adapted. Sharecropping, convict leasing, mass incarceration, immigration detention, apartheid, and modern trafficking all carry slavery's logic forward. So you can see from the Warsaw Ghetto to Gaza, from Jim Crow to the school-to-prison pipeline, racialized control is enforced through surveillance, separation, and containment. Even in democracies, slavery has persisted into quite literal living memory. Mae Louise Miller escaped literal plantation slavery in Mississippi in 1961. Mauritania did not make slavery illegal until 1981, and it was not criminalized until 2007. Slavery is not only a historical crime, but a living structure that protects profit, defends power, and normalizes violence. The Mafa is not over. The Maangamazi continues. I want to remind everybody, beware the fascist impulse. I said this last week, but it's an expression from the three-way fight perspective, underscoring the importance of maintaining vigilance and caution against tendencies or inclinations aligning with fascist ideologies. It serves as a critical reminder that elements of fascist thinking and behavior can surface in any context, urging activists to remain alert to such proclivities to stave off the ascent of authoritarian and oppressive ideologies. I put this last week, but colonialism equals exported fascism, and fascism equals imported colonialism. Fascism is colonialism turned inward. The same logic used to justify conquest, racial hierarchy, and violent domination of colonized peoples abroad resurfaces at home when elites feel threatened. This is the dynamic called the imperial boomerang. Colonialism is exported fascism. Fascism is imported colonialism. Their tactics are structurally identical: military occupation, cultural destruction, economic dependency, and rigid racial and gender caste enforcement. Fascism is not a collection of symbols. It is not a political party, and it is not the will of a single strongman. It is a fluid, adaptive process that reshapes itself to fit the needs of any historical moment. It may drape itself in populist rhetoric or claim to be anti-establishment, but at its core, its function is always to preserve elite power. At its heart, fascism concentrates authority through authoritarian control, rigid hierarchy, and orchestrated cruelty. Not random. It may appear random. It may be done randomly, but it is done through orders. It is orchestrated. It is a less coherent doctrine than a recurring pattern of domination, like mobilizing propaganda, nationalism, chauvinism, misogyny, homophobia, and reactionary violence to protect existing power structures and enact punishment upon lower classes and lower caste members. Cultural hegemony plays a central role in this process. So fascism recruits collaborators from oppressed groups to give its violence a veneer of diversity and legitimacy. So you can consider gender-critical feminists and TERFs who weaponize feminism against trans people, or the strange phenomenon of black Nazis and far-right influencers who legitimize white nationalism, Hispanic members of armed militias patrolling the border, Zionists who defend ethnic cleansing and genocide under the banner of security. These collaborators do not escape the hierarchy, they reinforce it. They're acting as enforcers and apologists for systems that ultimately target them as well. The three-way fight framework clarifies the role of fascism. It is one pole among the three forces, which is neoliberal capitalism, reactionary chauvinism, and revolutionary social movements. So neoliberal capitalism, which is seeking to preserve the neoliberal order, reactionary chauvinism, seeking patriarchal ethno-nationalist revival through violence, and revolutionary social movements, which is fighting for collective liberation beyond nation, beyond state, beyond religion. So fascism, I said this last week, it is not experienced evenly. Its weight falls along lines of race, class, and gender. In Jim Crow America, a middle-class white person lived under a flawed liberal democracy, while a poor black person lived under daily fascist control over their labor, over their movement, and over their survival. Women of color have historically been consigned to caretaking roles for others, stripped of the rights to express grief or anger without risking livelihood or safety. These disparities show that fascism is not just an abstract label, but a lived reality shaped by intersecting oppressions. Fascists may appear to oppose the existing order, but the only aim is to replace it with something even more exclusionary, more militarized, and more white male dominated, often aligned with Christian nationalism, white supremacist militias, and other reactionary currents. It thrives on political violence, street terror, disinformation, scapegoating, purges, cults of leadership, and backlash against feminism, against anti-racism, against anti-fascism, against queer liberation, and against labor rights. Its cultural markers are fear of difference, anti-intellectualism, conspiracy obsession, contempt for the weak, and glorifying war and death. The process is visible. Billionaires Elon Musk have publicly displayed Nazi imagery, amplified far-right memes, and promoted the pure genes through natalist and racial purity politics. Donald Trump kept Hitler's writings at his bedside, praised Hitler's generals, and surrounded himself with white nationalist advisors such as Stephen Miller and Steve Bannon, earning open admiration from neo-Nazi, alt-right, and anti-Semitic QAnon circles, alongside his fixation on good genes. Venture capitalist Mark Andreessen wrote the Techno-Optimist Manifesto, which takes inspiration from Filippo Tommaso Moretti's 1909 Manifesto of Futurism. Now, Marinetti is, of course, the co-author of the 1919 Fascist Manifesto, and Andreessen has privately told White House officials a fascist talking point that U.S. universities have declared war on 70% of the population, and they will pay the price. So these are not accidents. These are proof that fascism is living. It is endlessly adapting, and yet always serving the same purposes: to enforce hierarchy, to crush dissent, and to unleash reactionary violence in defense of elite power and rule. So I'll close it out with this. Fascism and colonialism are often described as siblings born of the same parent, capitalism. But this framing implies that they have different victims, sustaining that us versus them friction that was crafted by the narcissistic, psychopathic architects of these systems. In truth, all human beings are targets of this violence. Fascism and colonialism are not siblings, but the same child, driven by the same antisocial impulse to dominate. They are simply methods for subjugating the intended victim. They fuel it with propaganda that diverts public anger away from elites and toward those who are already suffering. So whether they're victims of murder, victims of rape, victims of kidnapping, victims of torture, assault, theft, and all too often many of these combine together. So these systems will not collapse from shame. They don't have any. They don't have shame. They will collapse only when we make them. So their violence is global. Our resistance must be too. So with that, for next week, we'll be finishing the trio section of the educational practices and transformational practices, pedagogy of the oppressed. Again, if you want to support, you can. I'll leave this up here. Venmo, Zelle, PayPal, Cash App. This is going to be free for the whole time I'm doing this. I want this to be a free thing for everybody, but this does help if you're able to. But yeah, today is a particularly challenging topic. This I actually think is the hardest topic to cover of all the sessions that we've covered. It was the hardest for me to learn about. It was even hard just reading the stuff. This is the most written material I think I've had, just because I knew I was not going to be able to get through the material because it's just so heavy and so dense. But I think it's really important to have a solid understanding of high control dynamics and fascism, as well as a basic understanding of capitalism and the imperial boomerang to get us into next week, which is about pedagogy of the oppressed. So we actually know what we're working with. So this was a crash course in political education from a liberation standpoint. And with that, you can stay connected. Check out my website, www.dorianwallace.com, as well as my Substack if you want to check out essays, workshops, and anything regarding liberation music therapy. And with that, catch y'all later.